Yes or no to this statement? Better elected Islamists than dictators. They won at the ballot box. So does that mean Islamists will buy into democracy, or does radical Islam become the order of the day? I'm John Donvan, moderator of the Intelligence Squared U.S. debates. Better elected Islamists than dictators. Only one side wins. Funding for Intelligence Squared U.S. is provided by the George L. Orstrom Jr. Foundation, Profit Capital, Paul E. Singer, the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, and others. A complete list is available from PBS. Another debate from Intelligence Squared U.S. I'm John Donvan. Welcome. Our motion is this: better elected Islamists than dictators. We have four superbly qualified debaters who have lived this issue for years, from well before Arab Spring, and they will be bringing to you their arguments for and against this motion. These debaters are here to try to persuade you of the power of their arguments, and you, our live audience, will act as the judges. By the time the debate has ended, we will have asked you to vote two times, once before the debate and once again after the debate, on the language of this motion: better elected Islamists than dictators. Let's have the first vote happen now. If you agree with it, push number 1. If you disagree, push number 2. So, on to round 1, opening statements from each of our debaters in turn, and speaking first in support of the motion, better elected Islamists than dictators, Reuel Marc Gerecht. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He served as a specialist in the CIA's Directorate of Operations and is the author of several books, including The Wave, Man, God, and the Ballot Box in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, Reuel Marc Gerecht.
It's a pleasure to be here. Last time I did IQ2 in London, I actually laughed so hard during the debate I pulled a muscle on stage. I will endeavor to be more restrained this evening. Let me sort of restate the resolution. I think what Daniel and Zuhdi are really saying is that better dictatorship forever than allow the Muslim common man, woman, to elect Islamists in a free vote. Now that's a pretty, I think, ironic position for them to take, because what they're essentially saying is they want to perpetuate the political systems which have allowed Islamic fundamentalism, including its most radical offshoots, jihadism, most famously Al-Qaeda, to actually grow stronger. It is no accident that Islamic radicalism has grown enormously during the period of dictatorship, secular dictatorship, throughout much of the region. It has been jet fuel for that cause. The societies that have been ruled by dictators and kings with ever coarsening, I think, rigor, have harmed their societies, have caused more or less an ethical collapse. I think Daniel, and perhaps Zuhdi too, would once upon a time have said with the best hope for the Islamic world, and that would be Turkey, all right? Because Turkey really had the model that everybody in the foreign policy community on the left and the right really liked. That was the model that you would have in enlightened dictatorship. You have someone like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He would come in and, through force of arms, literally, change the society, create the social basis for a more liberal order, and boom, down the pike, you would have liberal democracy. Now, guess what's happened in Turkey? You haven't seen the triumph, actually, of liberals yet in the ballot box. For the last almost 10 years, you've seen the Islamist party win. As the elections became ever freer, as the generals moved off, guess who became the dominant party? The AKP, the Justice and Development Party, which is an Islamist, I think Daniel would call it an Islamist party. So what that ought to tell you is that under no circumstances are you going to create a liberal order. in the Middle East without bringing along the faithful. You cannot have a dictatorship who will take the traditions of the past, who will take the ulama, the religious scholars, and throw them in the dustbin or throw them in jail. The only way you're going to get a more liberal order in the Middle East is through people of faith. It is through the fundamentalists participating in the system that you're actually going to develop the jousting ethic that is going to allow liberals to have greater chance. It's only through them participating that you're going to have people become responsible for politics. We don't know what's going to happen in Egypt. We don't know what's going to happen in Tunisia. But we can tell that in Iran, under a theocracy, under dictatorship, there has been a profound change, that you have fallen revolutionaries everywhere. I do not have time to go into the number of them, but it is an ocean. It is a tidal wave of people who were once hardcore Islamists, who have abandoned the faith or who have evolved their faith and have become pretty profound Democrats, if not liberals. So I suggest to you, if you want to see evolution, you cannot be in favor of greater dictatorship, which can only promise you stagnation. Thank you.
Thank you, Reuel, Marc, Gerecht. Our motion is better elected Islamists than dictators. And here to argue his position against the motion, Daniel Pipes. He is president and founder of the Middle East Forum, which publishes the Middle East Quarterly and sponsors Campus Watch, Islamist Watch, and The Legal Project. He is the author of 12 books, and his bi-weekly columns are read around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Pipes.
Thank you, John. And the good news, ladies and gentlemen, is that we basically agree on the fundamentals. None of us like dictators. We all want liberal democracy. None of us like conspiracy theories. So the question is not one of principle. The question is really one more of tactics. How do we achieve liberal democracy in the Middle East? And as you've just heard, the argument for elected Islamists is that this flushes out the system and you have responsibility and you have progress. I will argue the opposite case, not because I'm against responsibility and progress, but because I think that the Islamists, whether elected or not, whether violent or not, Islamists of any sort whatsoever, are barbarians, are totalitarians, are far worse than dictators. You're not going to look at me to find an apologetics for dictators. They're execrable, they're horrible, they're brutal, they're miserable. But the Islamists, elected or not, are even worse. One can distinguish between those dictators who are greedy. They're interested in their own welfare. They have huge amounts of money stored away. And in the pursuit of this greedy goal, they are going to harm you if you get in their way. But if you don't get in their way, they'll leave you alone. They don't have a vision. They don't particularly cooperate with each other. And they often do cooperate with us because they don't have any particular hostility towards us so long as we don't get in their way. Now that's bad. There's no apology from me on that. But the ideological dictators, be they fascist, communist, or Islamist, are far worse because they wish to impose their vision. They wish to create a global hegemonic state, in this case caliphate, in other case an international communist state or Nazi state. They have a vision for the new human being who they will redo. And if you get in their way, they will, even if you don't get in their way, if you disagree with them, they will be brutal with you. So in short, the motion that's before us, better, if you agree with this motion, better elected Islamists than dictators, you are in effect saying that you also agree with the idea, with the motion, better elected Nazis than dictators. Adolf Hitler was elected, was he not? These are the same people. These are totalitarians. So one, work with dictators but push them towards civil society and democracy. Two, always help the liberal elements. And three, always, always, always oppose the Islamists. They are our worst enemy. And wherever they come in, they are our enemy, and they are the enemy of the subjects that they rule over. And Reuel mentioned Turkey. Yeah, Turkey has become Islamist, as he mentioned, for the last 10 years. One sees a Turkey, which was always imperfect under the other parties, has under the AKP become far more dictatorial than it had been before, far more hostile in its foreign relations with state after state on its periphery, has the largest number of journalists in the world that are in jail and the like. So, in short, if we want to get to liberal democracy, which we all agree upon, the thing to do is to work with the dictators and improve the dictators and slam the door on the totalitarians and the ideological dictator. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel Pipes. We are halfway through the opening statements of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, fighting it out over this motion, better elected Islamists than dictators. You have heard 2 of the opening arguments, and now on to the third. I'd like to introduce Bryan Catullus. He is a fellow at the Center for American Progress. He has served as a consultant to numerous U.S. government agencies, private corporations, non-governmental organizations on issues related to the Middle East and South Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, Bryan Catullus.
Thank you. It's really great to be here tonight, and I can promise in this debate we're not going to talk about the debt. I'm not going to talk about my grandmother. I'm not going to talk about your tax rates. We've got a really juicy topic. And I'm going to break it down into 3 main points why you should vote in favor of the proposition and not against us. Number 1, no dictatorship can maintain the status quo that we see in the Middle East right now. A vote for the proposition would be a vote to accept reality. A vote against the proposition is a vote to stick your head in the sand. It's simply not sustainable. Number 2, elected Islamists will change in response to the politics. What I'm focused on are the people, and I lived over there. And I understand that the basic needs, basic security, jobs, and other things will drive politics. Maybe not in the early stages, maybe when things get a little rough, they'll be a little ideological, but by and large, Islamist politicians will be politicians. And we will need to support this long effort to actually push them to face the same pressures and constraints that other politicians face around the world. And the open debates that we have, like the open debate we're having here tonight in Intelligence Squared. I think this forum is phenomenal. I've watched it a number of times. And these sorts of open debates expose the voices of fear, expose the voices of hatred and demonization in ways that I think clarify. And this is what these societies in the Middle East are just starting to experience. So, again, a vote for the proposition is a vote for the possibility of change in these societies. A vote against it is for the status quo, which, as we said, is unsustainable and has harmed us. Third point, elected Islamists, not dictators, will defeat the radical ideologies of groups like Al-Qaeda. The fact that Al-Qaeda and its affiliates had virtually nothing to do with the removal of leaders in places like Egypt and Tunisia and the widespread calls for political reform and the battles that are still going, I think, is telling. The fact that Ayman Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, wrote a book attacking the Muslim Brotherhood for actually participating in democratic politics is telling. Looking ahead, it seems that Al-Qaeda's popular appeal, I think, will remain low, given that many of the protesters were out there supporting democratic reforms. People are going to the ballot box, the very thing that radical jihadists are opposed to. I'm going to say that we're faced with a great opportunity here. The popular uprisings in the Middle East, and again, we'll probably focus on that because it's the hot topic and it's the most uncertain. And Reuel and I agree that there's no clear path forward. And I think we're probably going to have a couple of steps back. We're going to see these countries fight with this all along. But tonight, if you vote against this motion, your vote is essentially saying, remember those good old days when Muammar Gaddafi was in power in Libya? Remember those good old days? Remember when he repressed and killed thousands of his own citizens? When he actually used the veil of Islamism at different times and passed laws in the name of Islam to try to establish his credibility? Remember Muammar Gaddafi used terrorists who actually bombed airlines and killed hundreds of Americans around the world, setting off the sorts of things that I think we're debating here tonight. Remember that? Then vote against the proposition. A vote for the proposition, is it a clear, certain proposition that we're going to see liberal democracy appear? I can't guarantee you that. But I actually think it's a better pathway forward than sticking with dictatorships. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan Catullus. Our motion is better elected Islamists than dictators. And our final debater against the motion, Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He is also a doctor and a former medical officer in the U.S. Navy. Ladies and gentlemen, Zuhdi Jasser.
Thank you, John. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. And one of the terms I think that's been thrown around here quite a bit, but yet it doesn't seem that our opposition understands, which is Islamism. And this motion, I cannot tell you enough as a Muslim and as an American how important it is that we not get this wrong. Because we're sitting right now at a tipping point in the Middle East. And if we get this wrong and we start to think, well, the Islamists are better than the dictators, we're going to then usher in even worse totalitarianism and dictatorship. But I'll tell you, as a Muslim, I'm insulted at people who believe that Islamism is progress for me as a Muslim. That somehow the theocrats and those with robes that memorize our scripture, that somehow know how to run democracy, when in fact it's an illusion. I think one of the things our opposition hasn't even begun to tell you is how they can trust one word that the Islamists tell them. They're deceptive theocrats who'll do anything to monopolize and control our societies. And I think one of the things our opposition seems to be doing, and if you vote for this motion, you'd be basically voting for the fact that somehow they want you to believe that we support dictators. And that's not why I'm on this side. I'm on this side of this equation because Islamists are not better than dictators, because we have been sentenced to two evils in the Middle East: Islamist fascism and secular fascism. They've both supported one another, they fed off one another, they're one and the same. And for our opposition to tell you that somehow, boom, the dictators exit stage left and what you're left with is a spring that you can plant new plants and soil, and somehow that the Islamists that somehow they come out of reform is just hogwash. So you need to understand what Islamism is if you're going to vote for or against this motion. And once you understand that Islamism is no different than what our founding fathers fought against when we fought against theocracy in this country, you'll realize that fighting against theocracy is the only way to achieve liberty. But American influence, please don't underestimate the influence that America can have if we try to tip this equation one way or the other. And if you believe that there's a third pathway for Muslims and for all those minorities and women and others in the Middle East, then you must vote against this motion. You must vote that Islamists are not better than dictators. They come from the same cloth, and Islamists actually are dictators on steroids. Forget the fact that women have less and less rights the more the clerics get in control. Forget the fact that the minorities are ousted, the fact that the Jewish population and Copts and others, the more Islamists get in control, the more minorities vacate the premises in those countries. Somehow we need to divorce ourselves from the reality of what Islamists do and say that they're a gateway into a future of hope for the Middle East. That's certainly not a gate that I want to walk through. And it's certainly, I don't think, a gate that the people that are giving their lives in the Arab revolutions, in the Arab Spring, which are really just convulsions against dictators, the people that are marching on the streets are not doing that to be handed over to Islamists. And you'll not see Egypt's Islamist President Morsi, for example, criticizing terrorist groups like Hamas or Iran or Saudi Arabia, even though he may give flowery language of parliamentary democracies and talking about women's rights, etc. But yet, when push comes to shove, just a few years ago, he was a truther, a conspiracy theorist. Just a few years ago, and just actually a few months ago, he's already met with the heads of Hamas and other radical Islamists. So this is a guy who's consolidating his power not only in Egypt, but globally. Islamism was what pushes him to consolidate power globally. And I think this is why you should vote against the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuhdi Jasser. And that concludes round one of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. So now we go on to round two, and round two is where the debaters address one another directly and they take questions from me and from you in the audience. Our motion is this: better elected Islamists than dictators. Arguing for the motion, we have Reuel, Marc, Gerecht, and Bryan Catullus. They have been arguing that you need to bring these guys into the political process because, number one, it's happening anyway. The side arguing against the motion, Daniel Pipes and Zuhdi Jasser, are arguing that Islamists are cannot be reformed, that they are intolerant, they are barbaric, they are totalitarian, far worse than any dictator, that they are deceptive and will do anything they can to stay in power. I want to put to the side arguing for the motion a premise that has been brought up by your opponent, Daniel Pipes, essentially saying that the this team is clearly not pro-dictator. They're not celebrating dictatorship. They don't like it. They're talking about a lesser of two evils. And in making that argument, they make the case that at least dictators can be worked with. It's a single individual, I assume, is part of your argument. The U.S. may have leverage over dictators in some cases, that they can be worked with and change can come about that way. And I'd like the side arguing against them and in support of elected Islamists to take that on. Reuel, Marc, Gerecht.
It's pretty hard to find an instance where you can find the United States successfully encouraging a dictatorship to evolve liberally in the Middle East. Daniel, said, I wish we had. Well, of course, I wish we had. I wish we had taken the Shah, had we done the Shah, put more pressure on him so he could have evolved and developed elections so you wouldn't have had a revolution. I mean, I just have to say this. Daniel's premise is that there's somehow, by the mighty hand of the United States, we're going to discover these hidden liberals in the Middle East, and suddenly, through America's nurturing, these liberals are going to come forward and defeat the people of faith.
Bryan suggested that we're advocating for stagnancy, but I think you heard me loud and clear, and Reuel just quoted me. I wanted to push, and today I want to push. In Algeria and Morocco and Saudi Arabia, I want to push.
But I think they're saying that in this case, in the Middle East, they cannot be pushed.
Of course they can.
Are you saying that they cannot be pushed successfully?
I think you can push, but let's just take Turkey. I mean, Turkey's the ideal. They elected an Islamist party. I mean, what would you have done differently in Turkey? As you just said, the 1990s created a more liberal order. Guess what happens? The people freely vote and bring in the Islamists. So I don't see, if Turkey's not going that way, how is Egypt, which is far less westernized, which has been much farther from the European traditions go?
Bryan, hang one second, Zuhdi, Jasser.
Yeah, you continue to use the old paradigm as if somehow all we have is to look backwards. And I think if there's any message from the Arab Spring is please stop looking backwards at the old and look at the new. And that the Arab Spring was a grassroots revolution. It wasn't about the old either clerics or the dictators. There's new choices there. This was a Facebook revolution, YouTube revolution, Twitter. It was about communications on the ground. The Islamists then hijacked the revolution, and now you want to hand it over to them as if there's no liberals on the ground. And I think it's insulting to the Middle East population to say that there's no liberals, on the ground. I've read hundreds of those leaders and scholars, but they've just either been in jail or suppressed by both of the ones you want us to believe.
Bryan Catullus.
Well, I think the notion that we could work with dictators today in 2012 and pressure them and things like this, it's quaint to me. It sounds like the Cold War. It sounds like a 20th century idea that worked back then, but doesn't understand statecraft as it is today, doesn't understand power as it is today. And I think we see this on full display with our colleagues here who are debating against this motion. Zuhdi equated fighting against theocracy with fighting against elected Islamists. And I got to tell you, there's a big gap between those two. And I also got to tell you that I think when I listen to them present their arguments, not only do they think that the people of the Middle East are foolish and will just listen to elected Islamists and re-elect them blindly, I think they think you're foolish tonight. Because I think the biggest argument that could be made is, and it's not about the leaders or what Morsi says and what he might not say. When I see Egypt today, Egypt after Mubarak is an Egypt where there's multiple centers of power that are competing for this. And they're fighting with each other. And yes, Islamists did well in the first round of elections. But guess what? I actually think in the next round of elections, you're going to see even more competitive space here.
Daniel Pipes.
You see an Egypt that's got lots of contending centers of power. I see an Egypt where the Coptic population is increasingly being repressed, murdered, emigrating, as it never has before. I see a population where women are being repressed as they never have been before. I see a country where the Sharia, a medieval law code, is being dredged out and applied, and you call us quaint? You're advocating for a medieval code.
Let me let Marc address that.
Yeah, I mean, one, the Sharia has been the rule of law for much of the Egyptian population all over the place for decades now.
Wait, can you, one sentence on what do you mean by that?
In the sense that the central governing structure had collapsed. I mean, one reason the Islamic fundamentalists were able to come in and have such growth is because the social order from the central government had just basically ceased to exist. And also because there are a lot of Egyptians out there who don't have a problem with much of the holy law.
If you really want liberal Democrats to rise, you can't, as the most powerful country in the
let
world.
them win.
Let me
in
ask
an
this,
election.
something that Zuhdi just said, he said that these Islamists that you want us to support, is that accurate? You want us to support Islamists?
It's absolutely incorrect. We're not saying vote for these Islamists. We're saying vote for the possibility of competition in these politics. And that's an oversimplification right there. And I think it's an oversimplification to say that this current U.S. administration supported Islamists over any other thing. They've supported the openness and people having a voice in their own debates.
Is there a distinction? Let me go to this side. If people vote for Islamists, is that the will of the people being expressed?
I don't believe so. Said Ibrahim said in the Wall Street Journal, he said, please give us 4 or 5 years until we have elections because the liberals need time to get infrastructure, to get institutions. And the people that would get legs now are only more of the old.
My old friend and teacher, Olivier Roy, made I thought, the pithy remark where he said if France had to wait for the development of a democratic culture, France would still be a monarchy. The notion that you are somehow going to push off into the distance 4 or 5 years, and you get the 4 or 5 years, another 4 or 5 years, that you're going to have suddenly liberals become strong in the dominant party, I think isn't serious. Ayman Noor couldn't win an election in Egypt right now if the CIA had paid every single Egyptian $5,000.
Daniel Pipes.
I find it curious that Zuhdi and I are celebrating, let's call them the liberals, the moderns, in Egypt and the rest of the Middle East, and you two are denigrating them and ignoring them. These are the hope. Why don't you put your faith in them? Why do you put your faith in people who have a code and a vision that is as antithetical to ours as could? Where is the moderation? Where have these people improved?
We have to get there first. What you're doing is closing down the option. You're basically saying you don't get to have the right to have a democratic process. And by the way, the Western democratic process, if you recall, was not terribly pretty. It was really ugly, took a long time. They'll have to go a really long distance before they actually have as bad a time as we did.
Daniel Pipes.
What we see in Syria is the bringing in of violent Islamism.
If I take your formula, and I respect your formula, I don't agree with it, but if I take your formula, Zuhdi and Daniel, you're going to rely on the goodwill of Bashar al-Assad to sit down with secular liberals and give up power and actually open up the political system. That's your formula right now.
I think that's all great and fine, and we should support liberal Democrats everywhere. I'm in favor of covert action programs all over the place. But I just don't see you've got the traction. And I don't see if you go to Mubarak. I mean, Mubarak made a real hobby out of squashing liberals like he made a hobby of squashing everybody else. So Mubarak says, no, I don't want to do that. And what's the United States going to do? All right, take the money away, take the money from the military, and then he says, all right, you're going to weaken me, the Islamists are coming. You've already said the Islamists did come. So I don't think you can create liberals in the Middle East out of sand. There has to be a process, an evolution. In the West, liberals were not born overnight. They came into being. It was, I don't want to go through Occidental history here, it was a very ugly process. What he is saying is that, no, you don't get to have that process. We had that process, but no, not you. Muslims don't get to evolve. You have to be born liberals now.
Zuhdi Jasser.
Reuel, I'm sorry, you're living in this academic bubble that is so far removed from the reality on the ground that you know, the reality on the ground is, as a Muslim, the Islamists never want debate, never allow debate. They suffocate liberal movements. And if you even look, let's take Turkey. The Secretary General of the OIC is Turkish. Give me one statement that man has made criticizing any other Islamic regime, Islamists from Iran to the Taliban, etc., to the Saudis, the Wahhabis. Not one, because together they seek a neo-caliphate, they seek Islamic hegemony around the world, and the Islamists don't allow debate. I can tell you this from experience, and it's no better than the dictators. And actually, American influence, if we want to help the liberals, and they see us saying, oh, well, the Islamists are a little better, they're going to throw us aside and say, geez, they're the Americans, go again, caring
Zuhdi,
not about us.
Zuhdi, Daniel, your partner, likened Islamists to Nazis. You agree with that? And I want to bring that to the other side. Nazis, they can't be reformed, and they're all the same. Can you take that on?
Oh, absolutely
Bryan
not. I mean,
Catullus.
especially elected Islamists. And again, we're at the early stage of an experiment here in many of these countries. But just look at the facts. Look at countries that are Muslim majority. They morph, they modify. I see it in Egypt already. And again, we're in the early stages. It's hard to game this out. But you have different strands of Islamism, even within the Muslim Brotherhood, which we paint Islamists. And this is sort of like a nice tactic people like to do, is lump 1.6 billion Muslims all together and talk about sort of political Islam in some sort of way and make us believe that these people, the constituents, are fools and that they'll just blindly follow some sort of theology here.
And you're saying not all Islamists are the same. I want to bring that
Nazis,
point to the other
ridiculous.
side.
This is a supremacist idea. Look at what this country came out of. I think you're forgetting American history. Our history was that Christianity reformed and separated church and state, not through really a simple process. It was revolutionary, with hundreds of thousands dying in Europe for the Enlightenment and then the American Revolution. Do you think that the Islamic world is going to separate mosque and state in any less violent type of a revolution? It's going to be major, and the Islamists are going to just sort of hand it over.
Reuel.
In Egypt, the Noor party of the Salafis is absolutely morally repugnant, all right? No doubt about it. But they are actually in the process of collapse right now because they haven't figured out how to handle the pressure of democracy yet. The Muslim Brotherhood is having serious internal debates because they haven't figured out how to handle. This is all new terrain for them. That's what we want. We want them to fight it out. It's not going to produce something pretty in the short term, but what they're suggesting, having dictatorship and somehow having the United States, oh, I'm going to create a liberal here and a liberal there and a liberal here, it makes no sense.
I want to let Daniel Pipes respond.
I think what this difference boils down to is that our opponents do not apologize for Islamists. You just heard it. I can't think of a single good Islamist, we just heard. And we sure don't apologize for dictators, Assad, Mubarak, and the rest. So nobody likes anybody. The difference is, you just saw Reuel scornfully, liberals, we're creating liberals, liberals, we're creating liberals. We think that this is the hope of the future. We think they do exist. We saw them. We saw them in Tunisia and in Egypt and Syria. We see them throughout the region. We believe they're the hope. And so we're trying to find a way to build them. They have given up on the liberals and are willing to go with the medieval. They're not happy about it, I gather, but they're quite ready to go with the medieval totalitarian order, medieval-style totalitarian order. Well, no thanks. Let's be hopeful. Let's try for a better Middle East. Let's work with the people who have a decent vision of the future.
All right, let's go to some questions.
Barbara Arfa
Thank you.
of New York City. I understand the premise of those of you who are speaking for the motion, and it's very enticing to believe that the Islamists will morph. What I don't understand is, how will they morph if there's so much violence that once they begin to change, they're in tremendous danger of being killed by other Islamists? There's so much murder, so much violence as part of that culture. Aren't they afraid to morph?
Perfect question. This side.
Look, I think
Bryan
they have greater
Catullus.
possibility to morph now than if they were facing Saddam Hussein, who killed hundreds of thousands of people. More possibility in places like Tunisia to morph than they did in Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, when you had organized mass murder. And let's be clear about this. I want to stress this. The transition in the Middle East is in the very early stages. The sorts of violence that we saw, and we've been talking about, that killed our ambassador in Libya, those extremists that killed him and murdered him, those sorts of things, we need to recognize that those threats have not been completely eradicated. We also need to recognize that the large protests against those extremists in Libya would never have actually happened under Muammar Gaddafi. We need to recognize that there's a space there, that I'm not in favor of elected Islamists or liberals or anything. I'm in favor of systemic change that has legitimacy. And I think this is a key distinction between what Reuel and I are saying and what the other team is saying. We can't implant this.
Would you want to discourage an election if you felt that Islamists were going to prevail in that election?
No. I mean, we fought communism without preventing the Communist Party from existing, et cetera. So I wouldn't want to outlaw. I think you can defeat them only.
My question isn't really that. My question is sort of the paradox of encouraging a democratic election, and then the election produces results that are anathema to you. Where do you go back a stage and wish that you hadn't had the democratic election?
No, I think it should at least, they shouldn't become our allies. We should at least make a stance that just because they were elected doesn't mean that we have to share their vision or treat them any differently than we would a dictator.
Okay. Another question.
Thank you. Dr. Ahmed, the author of In the Land of Invisible Women. I've lived in Sharia law in Saudi Arabia, and I'm of Pakistani heritage. So to my colleagues, I'd like you to say, better elected Islamists, comment on Pakistan's 65-year history, where it's advocated to be the world's first Muslim democracy, where there is no functioning democracy unless you are an Islamist sympathizer. Please comment on that. And let me also add, let me add, as a Muslim woman and someone who's lived and has friends and relatives in the Middle East, I'm offended that you think there are no innate liberals.
Bryan Catullus.
I didn't say that there are no innate liberals, and I lived and worked for 5 years in the Middle East. I go to Pakistan frequently. I talk to them all of the time. They're fighting that struggle. And I'll tell you right now, Pakistan's at an interesting moment that everybody's negative about Pakistan and what's going on. There's an interesting dynamic that's been under play there, and you've seen this. And I was there in 2009 when there was Sufi Muhammad, the head of Pakistani Taliban group, extremist group. He said that courts are un-Islamic. He said that elections are un-Islamic. And this was at a time, a territory called Swat, about an hour outside of Islamabad, was taken over by those very same extremists. And I was on the ground there. And the national outcry against Sufi Muhammad and the national protests against a video of a woman being beaten in that very same territory, the liberal and democratic response was there. And you saw it in the previous elections in 2008, the MMA, you know it very well. An Islamist party that said that they were going to ban cable television in northwest frontier Pakistan. You know what? A lot of men love watching WWE wrestling in Pakistan. These parties tried to rule theocratically and by a basis of religious ideology, and they failed. They were voted out in the ballot in 2008, and as you know, not end of story at all, because Pakistan is at a dangerous place. But yes, there are liberals there, and they are fighting against those radical Islamists. They are going to have an election, guess what? Next year. And they're having an open debate. That did not exist under Zia. That did not exist under the dictators that ruled, the military dictators that, quite frankly, were backed by the United States, like these gentlemen want us to do.
Let's hear
from
these
that
gentlemen.
That did not exist at all.
Daniel Pipes.
We don't want to back the dictators. Can I make it any clearer? We are not arguing for dictators. We are not arguing to extend their rule. We are arguing that we can influence them in a positive direction. I would love to see the dictators gone. I have an idea on who can replace the dictators.
My name is Ben. I'm an Englishman in New York, like the song. I have my heart is with Bryan and Reuel, but my head at the moment is with Daniel and Zuhdi. Reuel, you made a passing reference to France, and that got me thinking. The French Spring of 1789 was followed by 200 years of war, revolution, and genocide.
I'm getting worried on this question.
Yeah, I'm coming to the question now.
I'm getting excited, actually.
Yeah, I hope so.
There are decades to go.
So I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through the full 200 years. I'm just, how are you convinced that we can somehow avoid a repetition of that pattern in the Middle East? Because you planted those doubts in my mind by saying that.
Reuel Marc Gerecht.
I think the best answer to that is, and the simplest one is, revolutions are bad. You don't want to have a revolution. You don't want to have the violence that comes with a revolution. What you want to have is a transition that goes through elections. You want to avoid at all cost the triumph of the military men, the militarists. I would say in the Middle East, the real danger in the Middle East still in most places is not the Islamists, it's actually still the military. And that you want to have folks become responsible for their fates as quickly as possible.
I think the central fulcrum of their argument is somehow that the voting booth, that the election process, that once these citizens enter a voting booth, they somehow become liberals or Democrats, when in fact it's a mobocracy that they're advocating for. That somehow 50%, we learned in this country, we had to have a civil war and a civil rights movement until we understood what liberal principles were from our own constitution. So somehow they're telling us that elections are going to evolve this without a revolution, and the Islamists actually will entrench it more. And I think, again, you are insulting Muslims to assume that the collectivist concept of Islamism, that somehow all Muslims must think alike, have the same political party, have the same aspiration for the state, that there's no left to right, that we are all part of this brotherhood party, which is Islamism, is somehow freedom for Muslims, or otherwise we insult Islam. There are a majority of Muslims that don't want Islamists, don't want it on our back, and reject the entire notion.
I agree with that, and I don't know where that's. I agree with that, and I don't know where that straw man is sitting. The chair's not here. I mean, I agree with that notion.
The motion is the straw man.
Another question.
Will elected Islamists actually allow any evolution into democracy happen, or will they suppress it? That seems to, because I think we all like the idea. It's just, will it practically happen?
Okay, that's a question for the side for the motion. Reuel Marc Gerecht.
We don't know until it happens. I mean, you can't know this in advance. There is no way right now that we can be certain that you're going to have mini elections in Egypt and Tunisia and where else democracy spreads to. That is going to be, trial by error, by experiment. So, but unless you get there, you'll never know. So you have to go down that path before we can even answer that question. Now, I can give you a religious discussion of this, how I think on the Shiite side and the Sunni side, how Western ideas about democracy have penetrated, that can give you some hope there. But we just don't know until it happens.
Reuel doesn't know. Reuel doesn't know, but I do. No.
Oh, Daniel, you could have just left it there. It was perfect.
Constantine Katulis. I'm with Scholars for Peace in the Middle East.
Thanks.
Both sides indicated that they agreed that both choices of elected Islamist dictators were heinous, they're totalitarian, etc. There was a distinction made early on, and that wasn't addressed, that the same repressive regimes can operate, but one tends to operate local and local regional. And as the against side indicated, that there is a vast globality of vision and intent on the part of Islamists, that they have a vision that goes far beyond the periphery and the boundaries of the state, nation and state.
So
and that wasn't addressed, and so I'd like this side, the pro side, to address. Isn't that a valid distinction? That would suggest a far greater potential for ill on a global level
So
from Islamic fundamentalists and elected Islamists.
I think it's highly likely that if you have more than one election, that what you're going to see, and you always see it with democratic politics, is that your aspirations become much more localized. And I don't think that you're going to see any caliphate. I think the notion of that is a bit far-fetched. I think it runs against the most successful Western export to the Middle East, which is nationalism, which has profoundly affected even Islamist movements throughout the area. So I don't think that's a big problem. Now, you could find common purpose. It's entirely possible that you will have Islamists in one country look fondly and affectionately at Islamists in another country and seek to support them. That's possible.
What's the OIC? What's the OIC then? What is that?
It's a mess. I mean, the OIC...
Wait. Term of art. Explain the OIC.
The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is 56 countries that share nothing other than the fact that they have majority Muslim countries, and also the fact that they rejected the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and many of them say they signed it, which they did, but then they signed the Cairo Declaration that talks about blasphemy laws, apostasy, etc. So it's based out of Saudi Arabia, and they don't seem to be critical of one another.
Well, that's because the primary, the OIC is really about them saying in a rather childish way, you know, here we are, notice us, we're not the West, et cetera, et cetera. The OIC is, has been in the past sort of a concatenation of dictatorships that virtually the only thing they could agree on is how much they dislike the United States, how much they dislike the Israel, and other less concealed forms of anti-Semitism. I don't really see that the OIC actually has anything to do with the democratic process. It has a lot to do, it's sort of like an Islamic version of the United Nations, which I don't recommend. I don't think it's a moral paragon. It's most of the time, it's not very serious.
We have to wrap up this section, and I just want to bring up a topic that I thought would come from the audience, and it didn't, and we don't have much time, so I want to ask it very quickly to this side. And we haven't heard very much about the issue of women's rights. You all acknowledge that at this point, most Islamist movements are not friendly to women's rights in the way that we would understand it. And I want to ask this side, where do you draw the line on that? Where do you say, it can be open and it can be evolving, but in the meantime, in the short term, this abuse of women's rights just cannot be tolerated?
It's a red line, and I think we see the dictatorship of Saudi Arabia as one of the worst offenders of women's rights. And I think you see the places that have, again, Muslim-majority countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other places, with Islamist parties, respect for women's rights. And like everything else, in places like Morocco, too, where you have space for a discourse and a debate about this. And in Morocco, they had a mudawana, a code to improve the status of women's rights. So a big debate is happening here. And I don't believe for a moment that the rights of women under Saddam Hussein were a lot better than what we have today inside of Iraq. I don't believe that at all. And I think there's a fight that women, as long as they can go back to the ballot box, as long as there are institutions there, as long as there's accountability in the system, as long as women have a voice in those debates, I believe that you'll see eventually a more sustainable and legitimate foundation for women's rights in these countries.
15 seconds.
I have to say, when the dictators, when Mubarak wants to control the women in his population, he uses the Islamists. When the Saudis want to control the women in their population, the Islamist Wahhabis are the ones that they use to do that. So now all you're doing is you're elevating the judges and the teachers from their positions to run the whole country. I'm sorry, I'm not going to, I think we need to vote against the motion as a result.
And that concludes round 2 of this Intelligence Squared US debate, where our motion is better elected Islamists than dictators. And remember, we're now going to go to closing statements, and this is their last chance to persuade you of the power and the quality of their arguments. But before that, I want to remind you that you voted beforehand. Immediately after the closing statements, you will be asked to vote again, and the team whose numbers have moved the most will be declared our winner. But first, on to round 3, closing statements. They will be 2 minutes each. And speaking first against our motion, better elected Islamists than dictators, Daniel Pipes, president of the Middle East Forum.
Thank you. Expect the worst of the Islamist regimes. These are people who are not going to let go of power. One man, one vote, one time, or maybe 2 times is what you can expect. And therefore, I say better the greedy dictators that we can push around, that we can change, than the Islamist dictators who are our deepest enemies, who we cannot change, who will be there for decades to come, who will inflict enormous damage on their own populations, be aggressors toward their neighbors, and deeply mired in anti-Americanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel Pipes. Our motion is better elected Islamists than dictators, and here to speak in his position, closing statement on the motion, Reuel Marc Gerecht, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
You know, I think Daniel started off by talking about tactics. And I have to say, this is the part I simply don't understand. I mean, he says we have dictators to push around and make evolve. But they didn't evolve, and we did push them around. If liberals are going to triumph, they're going to have to triumph in a free election sometime. I don't see how in the Middle East, where the region has been defined by faith, increasingly so under dictatorship, that you get to imagine a scenario whereby suddenly through American pressure, intelligently applied, of course, because Americans always apply pressure intelligently, that you are going to create a liberal order without coming to the ballot box and testing yourself.
Thank you, Reuel Marc Gerecht. Our motion is better elected Islamists than dictators, and here to summarize his position against this motion, Zuhdi Jasser, who is president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy.
Even before we said a word, our opposition was trying to paste us with the dictators. And at the end, I think if you look at the poster children for Islamists, which is really the question in this motion, the poster children for the Islamism movement are the Muslim Brotherhood. If you believe that pessimism, that believing that Islamists are not better, but that pessimism will signal to the liberals on the ground that we are with them, that we will not support their new dictators, that ultimately you must vote against the resolution and against the motion. So many of our families have had it with dictators. Don't push upon our communities new dictators using religious language and suits. True moderation demands the abandonment of Islamism. You can't band-aid Islamism. It's a supremacist ideology. And it's bigoted to assume that Muslims and Islam can't have a third path, that Islamism is Islam, and it's not. So you must vote against the motion if you believe in real hope for those on the ground, and that those dying in the revolutions did not die in order to give opportunity to new Islamist dictators. They died for real liberty.
Thank you, Zuhdi Jasser. Our motion is better elected Islamists than dictators, and here to summarize his position in support of the motion, Bryan Catullus, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress.
We really have a choice here tonight. It's either to accept a reality that the dictatorships in the Middle East and in parts of South Asia have fostered the sorts of ideologies that led to the deaths of people in those societies and right here in Manhattan on 9/11. We can stick with that old system that is crumbling, a system in countries that have a population where more than half of the population is under the age of 25. And change is coming, whether we like it or not. And we can pretend like the system of dictatorships that we see in Saudi Arabia or in Iran or in other places, that we can work with them somehow and they'll open up. And that will actually whisper in the ear of liberals and they'll bring about change in those societies. We can continue to pretend that that's the pathway forward. I believe that the rough and tumble jousting of politics in these societies are the only thing that's going to produce the sort of legitimate change that comes from within. It's going to take a long time. It won't be simple or easy, but I actually think we stick with the process of democratization as it's unfolding, or we continue on the current path of that produce the sorts of extremists that we've seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan Catullus. And that concludes our closing statements. And now it's time to learn which side you feel has presented the more powerful and highest quality argument. We are asking you again to go to the keypad at your seat. That will register your vote, and we'll have the readout almost immediately. The motion is better elected Islamists than dictators. We're asking you to vote a second time, and this time to vote on the quality of the arguments you heard. If you feel that the team arguing for the motion presented the better argument, push number 1. If you feel the team arguing against presented the stronger argument, push number 2. And if you remained or became undecided, push number 3. Okay, it's all in. Our motion has been better elected Islamists than dictators. We have heard the arguments for and against this motion. You voted twice, once before the debate and once again afterwards. And the team whose numbers have changed the most by your vote will be declared our winner. And here's how it goes. Before the debate, 38% were for the motion, 31% were against, 31% were undecided. After the debate, 44% are for the motion, that's up 6%, 47% are against, that is up 16%. That means the team arguing against the motion has carried the day. Our congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US. We'll see you next time. Join the debate online. Cast your vote, watch highlights, and learn more about Intelligence Squared US debates at pbs.org/Intelligence Squared. Funding for Intelligence Squared US is provided by the George L. Orstrom Jr. Foundation, Profit Capital, Paul E. Singer, the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, and others. A complete list is available from PBS.
Be more PBS.